This is not a video about new SpongeBob being bad. This is not a video about older SpongeBob being good. This is just a video about SpongeBob, a cartoon character who cannot see, hear, or feel real emotions. I remember being about 15 or so when I logged onto Twitter one day and was presented with this clip from one of the newest episodes of SpongeBob SquarePants.
This, sir, is preposterous! I demand restitution!
I hadn't watched this show since I was a kid. My only method of consuming the series in my teen years was through Mr. Enter rants about how bad the newer seasons were. So when I saw this, my mind was blown. This looks spectacular! When did SpongeBob's animation get so good? Now, in 2023. When someone posts a clip from a recent SpongeBob episode, the replies are bombarded with folks ripping apart its visuals, saying that the animation is way too distracting, that it takes away from the comedy as the wacky faces have become a crutch for its poor writing, and that the old season's method was better, in which the characters would be expressive, sure, but they seldom used those money shots, the moments where a character would go way off model to elevate a certain joke and surprise you. And with that, it seemed that every time a new episode released, we'd have to go through this same song and dance again and again, which is met with said SpongeBob fans trying to reiterate time and time again that the animation of SpongeBob isn't the problem. You are. That the show is the exact same as it's always been, and the only reason it doesn't appeal to you anymore is because you're not in its target demographic, and so of course you wouldn't enjoy it. And just to nip this in the bud, because for some reason I've become the unofficial spokesperson for the new SpongeBob has bad animation crowd. Even in my videos most negative towards the guy, I don't think I've ever said the animation was bad. One thing I would like to compliment the show on is the animation. SpongeBob is consistently one of the most impressive ones I've seen, with how expressive it can be. And the backgrounds in this series are stellar, I really love the colors. I can't speak for everyone, but my views have never been about whether or not this animation style is good. It's always been about whether or not it fits SpongeBob and what the series was aiming to do in its beginning. But I guess that's the issue with voicing your opinion on the internet. The game of telephone goes further and further to the point where expressing how you think sometimes the gags can go a bit overboard turns into you thinking that the animation itself is bad and that you don't care about the medium, when that was never my argument. If you go back and watch my ranking video, in retrospect, I feel like I praised the animation more often than not. My issues instead came from the feeling that the animation was being prioritized over the writing. That the wacky faces and expressions were simply substitutes for the snappy, clever dialogue of its early years. An opinion I held after trying out some episodes of the modern era, and noticing how gag-driven the series appeared to be. I always remembered SpongeBob for its witty dialogue and occasional out-there moment that would catch you off guard and stick in your mind for years. Whereas the newer ones I'd watch all seem to be doing the same repetitive jokes over and over again, the humor deriving from a character just repeating the same thing endlessly, with the joke being, they said the thing that they always say.
Everything is so amazing! 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 Amazing!
And because of that, it made me put all of that blame on the animation. That they'd rather show you a funny face than tell an actual joke. But that's not fair. For one, I can't get mad at folks for not getting 5 hours into a video like that to hear what I think of the animation. It's much more accessible to watch a 45-second short where I try to sum up these thoughts within a single statement. But also, it's not constructive to imply that these things have any relation with each other. That the staff would intentionally try to focus more on the animation than good writing. I've also said before that sometimes it feels as if the artists are trying too hard to come up with the next big SpongeBob meme instead of reeling it back and knowing when to hit the audience with those exaggerated faces when, again, that's not really fair on the artists. It's impossible to assume the thought process behind this shift, but to imply it's for any other reason than they wanted to draw a funny face is a pretty cynical mindset to have, and for that I apologize, truly. See, every time I see this discussion, I feel like chiming in with my own 2 cents, but find it incredibly difficult to articulate my actual thoughts in a quick and easy to understand manner. Like I'm walking on eggshells. Because I'm no animator, I've never worked in the industry, and so for me to assume the intentions behind certain decisions is obviously going to be biased in some way towards my thoughts on current SpongeBob. But what knowledge I do have is what I think of this. I may not have the perspective of being a fly on the wall to have overseen how the series got to this point, but I do have the perspective of a longtime SpongeBob fan. Someone who watched the first 7 or 8 seasons as they aired and then came back years later to see what they had missed. So if you don't want to hear that, then that's okay. No, really, it's fine. You can leave. You don't need to listen to me, it's not like I have any authority in the matter. SpongeBob ain't going anywhere. Or you could stick around. Listen to what I have to say as an uneducated average Joe talking about a series that played an important part in my childhood. And if you disagree, great! Leave a comment, let's have a discussion. Even if just to say, fuck you, you have no idea what you're talking about, you clown. No, really, it's fine, honestly. So with all that, let's get into it. What I think of SpongeBob's animation evolution over the years, the pros and cons of each era, and to check out some of the brand new episodes that have come out since I last kept up with the series. People have been telling me they've started to strike a better balance between well-written stories and off-the-walls animation, so I'm curious to see if I'll come out of this having a newfound appreciation for the recent episodes. Who knows? Originally, I was gonna spend some time focusing on this weird as fuck animation purist thing I've seen popping up more, where people become infuriated at someone for liking newer media without having enough appreciation for the classics. I said that when talking about a show, I like to do more than just focus on the animation, and that there's other aspects I care to discuss more, and these people cried a fucking river like I just shot their dog. Like, dude, I just watched the dang cartoon and said what I thought about it. It's not that deep, bro. Make your own video about why Adult Party Cartoon is actually an underrated hidden gem, because I sure as hell ain't gonna make it. But I'm gonna tune all of that out and just focus on the Bob. When SpongeBob first began its run back in 1999, they had adopted a method of storytelling that its creator Stephen Hillenburg had quite the fondness for. That being, it was storyboard driven, with a small group of artists getting together and boarding an entire episode based off just a short outline containing the premise. The major beats were all laid out and they knew where they wanted the characters to start and end, but how they got there was completely up to the artists, which I believe truly allowed them to let loose and undoubtedly is the main contributing factor for many of the show's most iconic moments. I read a lot of testimonies from staff who had worked on the series in these early days who attribute this to its high quality. The fact that they were able to create these really funny bases for episodes and then punch up the story in dialogue later on.
There's a time and a place for a script-driven show, there's a time and a place for an artist-driven show, and I think SpongeBob works best because it's a cartoonist-driven show.
And we got to do a lot of cartoon gags. Exploited animation as much as possible.
Now, the opposite to this would have been a script-driven series, where a writer or a group of writers sit down and create a script for an entire episode, which is then handed off to artists to storyboard out for the animators. The advantages to this are obviously that when writing out an entire script, you're able to focus on the stories and the characters more cohesively, while the artists can then focus on, well, the art. Letting them go crazy and do whatever they want within the confines of what the script calls for. You know, they don't have to worry about also writing and making sure the story is still progressing, as all of that has already been laid out. I think it's interesting to talk about, as funnily enough, both of these eras, pre-movie SpongeBob and post-sequel SpongeBob, use the opposite method you would initially expect them to. Early SpongeBob, you know, the one with more stiff animation and more focused on dialogue, was board-driven. It starts with the artists, whereas more recent SpongeBob, basically everything after the second movie, switched to being script-driven. Ironically, SpongeBob's animation at its most expressive starts with a writer, but the more you think about it, the more it makes sense. Without having to worry about writing the story and figuring out where the characters are going to end up, the artists have a pre-existing base to work off, allowing them to put all their attention on pushing the characters to their extreme, posing and expression-wise. Something worth noting is that the series creator, Stephen Hillenburg, wasn't much of an animator in his early days, instead famously starting out as a mere marine biologist, going to the California Art Institute, also known as the dreaded Cal Arts, where he befriended Joe Murray, who would later enlist Hillenburg's help, making him a director on his new show for Nickelodeon, Rocko's Modern Life. Rocko is also a board-driven show, meaning it's what Steven would end up having the most experience with. So it makes sense that when given the chance to make his own series for Nickelodeon, he would adopt that same method, along with his general love for old Looney Tunes and the like. I think this is why if you look at season 1 of SpongeBob, the closest thing I'd compare it to would be Rocko, where the character's expressions are pursed and emphasized, but the animation itself remains rather simple aside from a few select scenes. With how hard it was producing quality animation on cells with a TV budget in the 90s, it made sense that when you're not able to afford to do a whole lot with your animation, that you try your best to ensure that the show at least looked consistently good, with characters more often than not standing around in their base model sheet layout cycling through select mods, which allowed them to allocate that extra time and budget they saved on scenes that were more visually interesting. Really, in its early years, there wasn't that much special about SpongeBob's animation. It wasn't bad by any means, but it sure wasn't pushing any boundaries. If you want that, then just check out Ren and Stimpy, where the artists were encouraged against using model sheets, so that each pose, each face, every single drawing could look entirely different. different, doing just about everything in-house. Whereas other shows were outsourcing their animation to different countries so they could cut costs, sacrificing quality in the process. But as a result of its much more ambitious animation and incredibly high standards from its creator John Kricfalusi, Ren and Stimpy became an infamously hard show to produce and work on, with everyone and their mother knowing about John K's eventual firing from Nickelodeon. There is merit to the idea that the end justifies the means, that if it weren't for all the dozens and dozens of scrap drawings that never saw the light of day because they just weren't up to snuff, that we wouldn't have a show that blew people away like those early Ren and Stimpy's did. But with that series' crash and burn, I think it became apparent to everyone that that kind of ambition wasn't feasible with how animated series were produced at the time. And that's why I believe that pre-movie SpongeBob found this perfect middle ground between the two. It knew when to show off its visual chops, and because of that, those moments stand out more in comparison to the rest of an episode where characters just stand around talking. Even adopting a couple techniques not started by, but at least popularized by the Ren and Stimpy crew, such as having these static shots of the character but beautifully hand-painted in a way to emphasize something, whether it be an object or a face. The thought process being that if they're not going to animate it, you're at least looking at something that's so well done that you'll want to look at it for a prolonged period of time. Funnily enough, quite a few artists who worked on Ren and Stimpy back in the day eventually wound up working on SpongeBob, a couple notable ones even remaining on the series to this day, such as Vincent Waller. So there's no denying that some of that influence has wiggled its way into the sponge. Although I find that quite ironic, as post-sequel SpongeBob shifted to a method of producing a cartoon that John K notoriously hated, believing that the only way to truly make a cartoon was through artists, not writers, taking shots whenever he could.
I hear these cartoon shows have 25 writers each.
Harvard graduate. Probably I'll make $5,000 a week to come up with this preposterous stuff.
I have no idea what the reasoning was for the switch to scripts in SpongeBob's case, although based on a couple tweets from artists who currently or previously worked at Nick, it seems to suggest that overall having a board-driven show is just too much work to put on the artists, with the pay not reflecting the fact that not only are they storyboarding the entire show, but also writing it. I think it also just highlights how different the industry is these days, especially after COVID. With so many jobs being freelance and done remotely, it probably wouldn't be wise to rely on people who potentially aren't even in the same room together to write all the dialogue for an episode. It must be cheaper and overall simpler to provide them with an already completed script. Again, that's just if I'd have to guess though, who knows. I focused a lot on how Hillenburg really wanted to do a show that was board-driven, but that's not to say he would have hated how it was handled these days. Quite the contrary, actually. With the release of the second film, he actually made a return to the series after stepping down from the first one. And while I don't believe he was attributed with writing or directing any episode, he definitely oversaw production at the very least and gave his approval towards the direction they were taking the show in. It has come to my attention that we are like 15 minutes into this video and I've yet to actually talk about any episode. My bad. So one argument I've seen pop up more frequently over the past few months is that while sure behind the scenes there have been plenty of switch-ups on how episodes are made, but the core of the show still feels the same. That the humor, writing, and characterization isn't all that different from the first couple seasons. And I'm sorry, I personally have to disagree because from what I've watched, their approach to storytelling comes off vastly different in comparison. Something I immediately noticed when working on my big ranking video where I watched every episode in order was how gag-driven the series was starting to veer towards. Whereas early on, I would argue it was driven by the characters. Their emotions and their conflicts push the plot instead of jokes or set pieces. Now obviously this isn't going to apply to every single episode. You're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place where if you don't give examples then you're not basing your argument on anything, and if you do give examples it's seen as cherry picking, so I'll try my best to explain what I mean, and I think the best way to go about that would just be to take you through a couple episodes from the pre-movie and post-sequel SpongeBob's. And again, just because I'm saying they're different doesn't mean I'm calling one definitively bad and one definitively good. This is more so for the purpose of highlighting the slight changes in how stories are approached and how, to me at least, it changes the whole vibe of the series. Comparing two random episodes would be a tad unfair, so to make it a little more even, I'm gonna use the first episode of the series, you know, the pilot, and compare it to the first episode of the season where I started noticing the shift, Season 9, with Help Wanted versus Extreme Spots. Being, well, a pilot, Help Wanted has to make some sort of effort to establish these characters to us, so we begin by seeing SpongeBob's morning routine, him getting ready for the day before bursting out the door and approaching the Krusty Krab where he wants to get their fry cook position. After initially feeling like not going through with it, his best friend Patrick encourages him to go ahead and apply, giving a little bit of exposition as to how badly he wants the job and how qualified he is for it. Before he enters, the cashier Squidward notices him and warns the owner Mr. Krabs about SpongeBob, and so trying to get rid of him, they say he can only get the position if he goes out in a wild goose chase and buys this spatula that doesn't even exist. As he heads out, a massive horde of anchovies come in and wreak havoc on the restaurant. And just when everything seems lost, SpongeBob bursts back in, somehow having found the exact spatula Mr. Krabs told him to get, and proves himself as being more than capable by beating the lunch rush and earning Mr. Krabs a shit ton of money in the process, ending with him getting the job. It's simple, but it's one of the best pilots to any cartoon for a reason. It perfectly sets up the characters while showing you an average day in their lives. There's a clear through line. SpongeBob wants the job, faces adversity, proves himself, gets the reward. Each scene here is driven by the characters and them trying to achieve their respective goals. In comparison, let's quickly go over the plot for Extreme Spots. We begin with SpongeBob and Patrick on the beach building sandcastles, before being alerted to a group of extreme sporties? Johnny Knoxville, him and his group being super action-packed and doing all these cool epic stunts. Amused by this, SpongeBob and Patrick want to join his crew. And after a bit of standing around and making jokes about them misinterpreting a British guy saying extreme sports, thinking he's really saying extreme spots, they get pushed into doing some stunts like riding a motorcycle and falling off a cliff. The crew, who have just accepted letting them be a part of their gang without really saying it, want to know what games they like to play, and so Sponge and Pat play jump rope. Then the Drasticals do it, then they blow bubbles, which is followed by the Drasticals doing it. SpongeBob then gets in a ring and loses a fight to a pillow, so Johnny comes in and beats it up. Then Patrick jumps in a dumpster, which is followed by the Drasticals doing it. SpongeBob and Patrick take them jellyfishing, which is ironically the most extreme sport of all, with the Drasticals all getting violently injured. But they're happy about it. British guy comes in and makes the same joke again, and that's the end. Obviously, this is one episode out of the dozens and dozens that have undoubtedly done more story-wise, but you see what I mean, right? Nothing feels influenced by the characters. Instead of each scene being driven by them and what they want, it's instead driven by what gags they can do. What silly scenarios we can think up for the characters to be in. And there's nothing wrong with that, I just can't help but prefer it the way it was done before. Like, I don't know, what if we started at Jellyfish Fields instead of the beach? SpongeBob and Patrick are going about their business when the Drasticals come in and shred up the place. There's so many hills and formations there, what if they were using it as like a little makeshift skate park? SpongeBob and Patrick get intimidated by them and try to get them to leave as they're disrupting the peace, and then the Drasticals make fun of them or something. Then they have to prove who's more extreme, loser has to leave. Ending with the Drasticals getting attacked by jellyfish like in the final. Not a 10 out of 10 episode or anything, but there's something. But, at the same time, I get why they feel as if that's not necessary. We're at season 9 and like a million episodes in. At this point in time, everybody and their dog knows SpongeBob. Less needs to be done with the characters because you know how they act. It doesn't matter that the jellyfishing comes out of nowhere at the end because this is SpongeBob. You already know he likes jellyfishing. And that's fine, I can't stress that enough. But for me personally, I've always been a fan of the approach that acts like each episode takes place within a vacuum. Even if there is continuity, an effort is made to cater towards someone who may have never seen an episode before. I only bring this example up because I was literally watching it last night, so it's fresh on my mind. There's probably a better one, who cares, but lately I've been watching through Futurama for the first time, which has been great so far. But that show does so much in regards to making things clear to a new viewer. In the pilot to that show, we see our main character, Fry, in the present day where he briefly gets dumped by his girlfriend. It's quick and just meant to establish that he's got a crappy life there. But way later in season 2, they have an episode where he finds her being released from the same cryogenics lab he came to the future in, where they then have a plot about them reuniting. It's not really relevant. It would have been easy for this to be the first time we see her. Just assume that the viewer knows who this is if they've seen the pilot, and if not, the context of an ex-girlfriend is all they really need. But even then, during the beginning of the episode, they still make an effort to establish that to a new audience. It's not necessary by any means, and the episode would have been fine without it, but it shows an intention to tell a complete 3-act story, with elements introduced in the beginning that pay off later. It's easy but effective in making an episode feel like a completed narrative. Nothing comes off like it's coming out of left field. SpongeBob, of course, is not going to be able to do that as heavily since its average episode is about half the length of Futurama's. But something, anything, no matter how small, goes a long way. And that's not to say that no episode before the first movie was similar to Season 9's approach. You know, you have episodes like No Weenies Allowed, which primarily features SpongeBob in one location going back and forth with the gags getting more and more extreme as it goes on. But even then, SpongeBob has a reason for wanting to get in other than, well, he wants to. His friend is going in there and he wants to join, becoming offended when he's not seen as being tough enough. which is established as something he cares about, as the entire opening to the episode is a prolonged scene of him and Sandy fighting. I feel like if this episode were approached now, the mindset would be, well, we already know SpongeBob likes karate at this point, we don't need to showcase that. Even the episodes between the two movies, which typically are seen as the dark age for the franchise, I'd argue are more in line with pre-movie SpongeBob than the post-sequel seasons are. Boy, I hope you're keeping up with this terminology, it is a nightmare. But that's not where the main source of contention here comes from. It comes from the wacky faces. It's no secret that I've been quite public with my thoughts on current SpongeBob's animation style. And while I often see my points exaggerated and pushed to extremes that I never once claimed, you know, it went there for a reason. I did express that I wasn't a fan, but I think the writing plays such an important role in why I think that. Again, the animation on a technical level looks great. A little weightless. I think when every character can squash and stretch to their heart's content, it lessens the impact of their frequent slapstick. But I think it only bothered me so much because I felt it was being prioritized over the writing, which I of course now understand that not to be the case. But even then, some might say good. The animation should be prioritized because it's a cartoon. But I think that fails to acknowledge where the series got its beginning, and why those first few seasons were so successful. And I think the dialogue and jokes played into that more than the animation did. Post-sequel, SpongeBob feels like one big apology for those middle seasons between the first and second movie. The visuals at that point had a major focus on gross art. Super detailed shots of a character contorting our giant veiny monsters, or all the times we'd see a character's blood and guts and skeletons exposed. It didn't work because despite all of this, it looked so bland. It's very strange because if you take a look at a lot of the art in the production stage, mainly by Robert Ryan Corey, you'll see these same drawings when they looked great. These are some phenomenal, really cool and unique depictions of the characters. May not be your ideal SpongeBob, but you can't deny the talent here. But then, you take a look at these same drawings in the finished episodes, and something just feels off about them. There's a charm to hand-drawn sketches and animation that sadly gets lost in translation when done over digitally. I think maybe it has to do with the line art. It's trying too hard to be on-model with sketches that purposefully go out of their way to be off-model. There's also no real variation to the line width compared to the sketches. I don't say this often, but I think if anything, the line art is too thick, not allowing you to see those subtle nuances that come with thinner, sketchy art. In comparison, it feels like now they're making an effort to allow the artists to have fun with it, sprinkle in their own touch of SpongeBob and Friends. It's very much one of those shows where if you're even a casual fan, gonna pick up on certain artists and their quirks. Such as Aaron Springer, who had been working on episodes up until season 8. If you look at some of his original boards, they were fucking massacred into this lame as hell, super sanitized, on-model version of the characters, which the middle seasons were infamous for not straying too much from. For a while, SpongeBob was either disgusting or soulless, no in-between. And so it feels like, now at least, they've started to embrace that aspect, every artist's unique vision of the characters, which has resulted in the SpongeBob we see now. I can only ever see artists being allowed to art as a good thing, but I think in some regards, the emphasis put on this more exaggerated style of animation has affected the show's humor in some ways. And while some may like this change, it just isn't what I go to SpongeBob for. SpongeBob always had a formula in its style of telling jokes, but I imagine it was approached similar to a 3-panel comic strip. You got the setup, the build-up, and then the punchline. Not every page was like this, but I'm sure at least on a psychological level, working that way will bring that out of you. It's such a natural format for telling jokes. Because it was all done on paper too, you had to restrict yourself when it came to how varied the character's movements could be. If you wanted a character to change their expressions midway through a sentence, you had to draw something entirely new. And with budgets and deadlines to consider, it's most likely why when the characters are talking, they're more often than not holding the same face and position until they're done. In comparison to now, where storyboarding has never been easier. Want to draw a new expression? Just click a button and you have a blank canvas. Copy and paste whatever doesn't need to be redone, and there you go. The characters can shift, bend, and exaggerate as much as you're willing to draw. There were methods like this for drawing on paper. I noticed whenever they want to reuse a position but with minor changes, they'll more often not just draw the silhouette with the added detail so the animator knows what needs changed. But there's no denying with how accessible these art programs are nowadays, that storyboarding something expressive and varied has never been so simple. I'm sure the amount of boards it takes to complete an episode now are monumental compared to what it was done traditionally. And I think that's the main reason why we get these clips shared around online where characters change to a different face every other word. I'm sure if we had that technology when the show first started, we'd be seeing something similar. And it's not even really that severe. There's a few select moments where it definitely goes too far in my opinion, but these moments aren't as frequent as people say they are. I guess I'm included in that, aren't I? My bad. These characters have been around for so long now that people have had literal decades to learn how to draw them and add their own spin. And we've seen the show slowly adapt certain changes over time. One I see folks complaining about online a lot is SpongeBob's design differences. You know you've seen one of those amazing DeviantArt drawings where it's old SpongeBob beating up new SpongeBob. They're great. Now, some people may look at these two images and go, what design change? He virtually looks the exact same. But, being a Sonic fan, I'm used to arguments about minor design differences and how they can drastically affect how your character comes off. And I think these differences in his design, again, highlight the different approach to writing. Steven Hillenburg claims he wanted to present SpongeBob as a bit of a nerd. I mean, he's a fucking square. Just look at his outfit. And remember when he used to wear those fucking giant glasses? He was into comics and activities that were seen as nerdy in his universe, like jellyfishing, and everything about his design conveyed that. Later, as the series went on, they started leaning more into SpongeBob's innocence over his naivete, bordering on making him a baby, and therefore how they drew him played into that. They made his eyes smaller, his pupils bigger. They almost never had his little cheek thing sticking up anymore, instead starting to aim it sideways. Minor differences like that go a long way in changing how a character feels, and I think most agreed it was for the worse. Nowadays, I think they've yet again started to drift away from the baby SpongeBob we had for many years, and are instead leaning more into a SpongeBob that's a bit of a silly goofball. No, that's not to say that was never a part of his character before, but now more than ever they've begun emphasizing it. His eyes are back to being ovals, his little cheek thing has been made way bigger in certain cases. A lot of the time they push his legs together now, and are way more creative when posing him. He's also presented as much more of a short stack. It may feel redundant, but he just looks more square. This fits with the tone they're going for, and on its own, he looks great. But I feel it's clear some of that initial simplistic charm has been lost. I always loved this model sheet drawing of him where he looks like he's bursting out of his pants. He had more of a curve to him initially that was quickly dropped. It's just such an interesting case of how little details go a long way. For example, I could not imagine some of these post-sequel episodes working if he still had that Season 1 look. And a lot of Season 1 probably wouldn't be as charming if he looked the way he does now. They both perfectly fit the vibe of what the director is going for, which is only pushed further now that the directors and storyboard artists have more freedom to do whatever they want. And even then, with current SpongeBob, now that they're cycling through select directors, the SpongeBob they present is slightly different to the last. It's weird. I've been stuck in the middle of this argument for so long that I had begun to feel like I needed to provide reasons for why I thought the animation style of the post-sequel era didn't work. I did this for so long that I genuinely started to believe that I thought the new show had bad animation, only to start work on this video and realize that I've never really said that as far as I'm aware. There's without a doubt a case to be made for the charm of those initial few seasons being lost over time. You know, when you make a show that's so wacky and balls off the walls all the time, it makes those moments less and less impactful the more you do it. SpongeBob's animation looking so good doesn't have the same effect as it once did back when I saw that tweet when I was 15. What folks were once amazed by is now just the norm. And I think that more than anything highlights why we're now starting to see the discussion of, sure this looks good, but does it fit SpongeBob? I watched a few episodes from the recent season, even rewatching some from my ranking video, and I can definitely see them making an effort to find the perfect balance between funny visual gags and still containing a well-written story. And in some cases, it works pretty wonderfully, like in Ma and Pa's Last Hurrah or Spatula of the Heavens. They do a much better job than previously mixing a plot with the occasional little montage where they can show off their creativity. And while sure there's still the occasional blunder like, dude, I'm so sick of Nosferatu and this dogshit little henchman, I don't get why they take up so much screen time now. But let's be real, the original 3 seasons had its fair share of shit episodes. And while I can't personally say that I've suddenly become a huge fan or anything and plan on watching every new episode release, I appreciate a lot about new SpongeBob. That there is a show these days that is willing to let artists just do what they want. Just because I personally don't get a whole lot out of it doesn't mean nobody else does, because clearly, these new seasons and even stuff like the Patrick Star Show resonate with a lot of people. I guess, at the end of the day, my main source of contention with SpongeBob was that it felt as if for a while the show became complacent. Too comfortable with the status quo. They know you know the world. They know you know the dynamics. And so why would you stray away from what people are used to? I think that has resulted in some of the weakest episodes of the entire series, such as the Season 13 episode Seaman Sponge Heaters Club, where the whole thing consists of characters who don't like SpongeBob, recounting the reasons why they don't like SpongeBob. Like, what new are you offering here? I think that's why I at the very least appreciate them finding that balance better. Maybe SpongeBob isn't what I remembered it as being whenever I was a kid, but it's been going on for 25 years. What else would you expect? But that doesn't mean the new stuff is bad, it's just not for me. And maybe that's okay. SpongeBob. I feel completely neutral towards new SpongeBob. Again, my point here isn't to say one is objectively bad, more so just pointing out that these differences do exist between old and new. But something I always enjoyed about early SpongeBob was that he was just a guy. He had such a wide range of emotions, happy, sad, angry. Sure, they more often than not focused on his naivety and optimism, but it was never overbearing unless the plot demanded it. I really think SpongeBob is a franchise that suffered from its success when it came to flanderizing their characters. Like, over time it bought into its hype too much. His face got slapped onto everything with a massive toothy smile and wide shiny eyes. So much so to where after a while, that kind of became all SpongeBob is. In those middle seasons, they really focused on him acting like a dumb kid, bordering on being a baby at times. And as a kid, I didn't bat an eye, but I could always tell something was slightly off, but you know, it's SpongeBob. I like SpongeBob. And for most kids, that's good enough. But when being able to look at the series then, in comparison to how it began, it's night and day. That issue certainly got better as they started transitioning into their modern era, I guess it's called. But SpongeBob still has that issue of being too happy-go-lucky for my taste. Again, he's too one-note. In a way, it's like the character traits become gags in and of themselves. SpongeBob works at the Krusty Krab. He loves Krabby Patties and jellyfishing. That's his character. SpongeBob acting naive is no longer a character trait. That is the joke in and of itself. Again, it becomes too obsessed with itself. In the early seasons, the Krusty Krab is this sort of run-down, not good but not bad fast food place that's usually struggling for consistent business. Yeah, sure, SpongeBob loves it and thinks it's the greatest place under the sea, but that's his naivety at play. However, as the series goes on and becomes so popular that every aspect of it becomes a staple in pop culture, selling fucking gummy Krabby Patties and Krusty Krab play sets, it becomes this weird shell of its former self. Now, Bikini Bottom contains a society that will quite literally collapse if the Krusty Krab isn't selling Krabby Patties. SpongeBob went from this kind of nerdy guy who nobody respected, to now frequently being the savior of the entire ocean because of his burger-making abilities. I have to stress again, it's not bad, but it's so far removed from where we started. You know what's great about being in the UK? I get to see Sponge on the run before any of you damn Yankees get to. Enjoy your low-quality rips while your country erupts on fire, you absolute clowns. Hope you enjoy your free trial of CBS All Access next year, you charlatans. Because I, Mark, got to see the new SpongeBob movie, and it wasn't very good. Aside from scrolling through Twitter and seeing my American friends doom posting, I'm getting a lot of reactions to Sponge on the Run, the latest SpongeBob movie from the loins of Nickelodeon and Paramount. In spite of having a good chunk of the staff from the first movie, this feels way more soulless and greedy than any other piece of SpongeBob-related media. Even this shirt. What a hoax. In spite of some stellar animation, which manages to capture the kinetic energy of the original cartoon in great, stylized CG. Like, look, they gave him his season 1 design. He's even got misshapen pupils, and look at his feet and legs. Look at his cute little shoes. They really don't manage to craft a compelling story around it. Instead, it's a rehash of a previous episode, with about a quarter of its runtime dedicated to being a backdoor pilot for this awful-looking spin-off show where SpongeBob and his friends are babies at summer camp. Before we go into all that though, allow me to get a little more in-depth with the plot. Plankton kidnaps SpongeBob's pet Gary and hands him over to King Poseidon, the ruler of the sea. You know, despite Neptune always being portrayed as the ruler of the sea in the show. But don't worry about that, this isn't the only piece of lore they decide to step on. So SpongeBob and Patrick have to set out on an epic road trip to get to the lost city of Atlantic City. So it's just like the first one, right? The two approach comedic set pieces, new foes, and face treacherous hardships on their way to retrieve the prize. I wish. I really, really wish it was. A shameless rehash would have been a lot better than literally nothing. SpongeBob and Patrick set out in their vehicle to get to Poseidon. Then they get there. To be fair, there is some stuff that happens between then, but it's later revealed to be a dream sequence, a dream sequence that goes on for 15 minutes, oh boy. This is the worst part of the film. Not only does it add nothing to the plot other than funny Keanu Reeves, but it's just really bizarre and weird and not in the usual SpongeBob fashion. The initial teaser poster for the movie was all trippy and had the tagline, "This movie is gonna be a total trip." I thought the second movie was already really weird, so I wonder how they're gonna top that. Well, they don't. Everything in the movie is relatively standard fare, except for one random dream sequence where SpongeBob and Patrick visit an old western town and have to free the spirits of lol random epic zombie cowboys who dance and sing along to an epic song by Snoop Dogg. How wacky. I could give you a more in-depth plot synopsis, but that's really all it is. The only noticeable things about the plot are again the dream sequence with the desert town, and Keanu Reeves, he's just there the whole time. After the dream sequence, he tags along. And it's amazing how you can wear me out on Keanu Reeves, but they do it. They managed to make me sick of Keanu goddamn Reeves. And he's probably still the best part of the movie. It doesn't feel like an epic quest to find Gary. One, because they find out exactly where he is immediately after finding out he's missing. And two, they get to the Lost City with 55 minutes left of the movie. This film is an hour and a half, and they reach their destination in about 30 minutes. After this, they piss about for a montage that goes on for way too long, and suddenly the rest of the cast decide to jump cut to the city to help out, in a scene, by the way, that is also a direct rehash of another older SpongeBob episode. Did they really not have any ideas? Well, they did, because there was a cancelled third SpongeBob movie about these weird alien cat guys that come down from space, and while it doesn't seem like it would have fit a SpongeBob movie, it's a lot more interesting than this. Not even the city of Atlantis is unique to the movie, since they did that in a special too. And hey, at least they got David Bowie to voice the leader of Atlantis in that special, and not the same guy who voiced Bubbles the dolphin in Sponge Out of Water, which is really damn noticeable. I haven't watched that movie in like a year, and I noticed it immediately. The only other real positive about this movie's narrative is that they actually have something to do for the rest of the cast and aren't shafted or sidelined. The first SpongeBob movie has recently been observed through a more critical lens, with more and more people bringing up its flaws, with one of those being about how it seems to ignore the main cast of characters that aren't just SpongeBob and Patrick. Personally, I don't really agree with this complaint. The movie's focus is about them and their growth as characters, so I don't really mind that characters like Sandy or Squidward get the shaft. The second movie definitely did a better job at using SpongeBob's other friends. That film was a lot less focused on the characters and mostly just aimed to be surreal and weird. But Sponge on the Run seems like it's trying to take both of these approaches, and it doesn't really succeed at either. They end the movie's first act with SpongeBob and Patrick being genre savvy, talking about how this is a buddy road trip, and eventually they're gonna have a fight and break up, only to come back together even stronger. Like, they even have SpongeBob break character by being a massive dickhead to Patrick completely unprompted, just to make the joke work. SpongeBob can be mean at times, but it always feels earned, or when he's at his absolute breaking point. That's what makes those times when he gets aggressive so funny. But here, he just seems to be a little prick for no reason, other than a really lame fourth wall joke. What makes this all worse is, they attempt to subvert these tropes, but then do them anyway. Like, they get into a fight later down the line. It wasn't even of any consequence, they forget it in 2 minutes, like, literally 2 minutes, it's dropped entirely. There are so many instances where you can feel the writers high-fiving each other, thinking they're so clever at all the jokes they make about buddy trope movies. Oh man, you guys, what clever little twips, so silly. But the rest of it is just an unfunny rehash combined with a backdoor pilot that retcons the main cast into a summer camp story. Each of SpongeBob's friends get a little flashback segment to show how SpongeBob affected them, and what a positive influence he is. But it's just so rote and by the numbers. Like, Patrick is homesick and SpongeBob says he'll be his friend to help him feel better. Then he feels better. Sandy says, I want to be a scientist, but thinks due to being a squirrel she can't for some reason, but SpongeBob just says, you can though, and she's like, okay. It's such basic manipulative garbage. I see people calling this emotional, and it's not even on par with like C-list sad Disney moments. I think I have a higher chance at crying watching Home on the Range than SpongeBob and friends go to summer camp. Like, I get what they were going for. I think a scene like this could be amazing if the rest of the movie were able to back it up. But the context behind it makes no sense. So SpongeBob is about to be executed for trying to steal Gary back, and is basically in court. And as a defense, the gang all recount stories about how great of a friend SpongeBob is. Okay? What does this have to do at all with him trying to steal Gary? That's what he's getting punished for. I don't think him being a good person is gonna relieve that. There was no build up to this at all, yet for some reason I'm supposed to care about all the characters talking about the time they met SpongeBob. At the beginning of the movie, they hint at the fact that SpongeBob is filled with self-doubt and doesn't have the confidence to do that. So how about have this be where SpongeBob is at his lowest point, and so his friends need to build up his spirit again, to give him the fortitude in order to save the day? But the way they went about it just comes out of nowhere. And they legit do the same thing that the first SpongeBob movie was mocking, same tone and everything, it feels so forced.
Then I realized the formula
is more than just a list of ingredients and flavor capturing methods.
Or some other third thing.
I'm sorry, but it's hard to get emotional at this sort of thing, when I can't help but see it as a dumb excuse to shoehorn in these camp segments to get kids pining for more baby SpongeBob. And that's not even to mention how dumb an idea Kamp Koral is, but there's already thousands of videos discussing that. So I'll just say that as one of the people out there who cares way too much about the lore and continuity of an episodic children's cartoon, it annoys me to no end. But honestly, I could forgive all of this. I really could. I could forget about the uninteresting new characters, rehashing of previous episodes and poor pacing, because this is SpongeBob after all. And at the end of the day, SpongeBob is a comedy, and a really funny one at that. I still regularly watch through the original 3 seasons and think they're hilarious. And while I wasn't a big fan of the second movie, I still will stand by the fact that it's really funny, and I occasionally watch it again for the humor alone. But this has gotta be one of the most unfunny pieces of SpongeBob media. And it's not because the jokes they tell are bad, there just barely are any. Like, there are times in this film where they get away with a kind of funny joke, like SpongeBob and Patrick sitting in their jail cell, or the stuff with Sandy's robot Otto. But in between that are like 10-minute chunks, where it's more boring and uninteresting more than anything. The pacing is so slow. Scenes go on forever. How about ditching that dumb zombie cowboy scene that went on for an eternity, and split it up into smaller, more random segments that show what issues SpongeBob and Patrick face while on their travels? I know that'd just be doing the same as the first movie, but I'd honestly rather take that over whatever this is. Strangely, I saw a lot of people rolling their eyes at the amount of licensed music used in the film, such as a cover of Take On Me performed by Weezer of all bands.
Oh, it's just Weezer. Weezer? Oh my god, it's Weezer!
But it didn't really bother me all that much. I'll take it over an ending done by the epic rap battles of history guys. The only thing that was somewhat off-putting to me was the mention of apps like Skype or FaceTime, which felt very out of place. And the original soundtrack was a major letdown. The original movie had Best Day Ever, SpongeBob and Patrick confront the psychic wall of energy, Just a Kid. I could go on, there are way more. Then the second one has that bizarre Squeeze Me song, which was decent. What does Sponge on the Run have? Agua. I can't play it for obvious reasons, but please look it up. It is awful. Hello, this is editing Mark, by the way. Where the hell was the Gary Come Home remix? It was the perfect setup. I won't go on for much longer, mostly because this movie is so devoid of substance that I don't really know what else to say about it. But also because I'd recommend checking it out for you to still form your own opinion. Who knows, maybe you'll end up loving it. It's not like I want to hate this movie. Sure, I wasn't a fan of the Sonic movie, I hated Scoob and Candace Against the Universe, and okay, I can see why people may think that, but I really do want to like these movies. And I really love SpongeBob and wanted this film to be great. And I'm honestly really disappointed that I wasn't all that into it. Overall, Sponge on the Run is perfectly serviceable at best, and at worst, it's the weakest of the 3 SpongeBob movies, with a rehashed story, forced in emotion, poorly paced, and in the end, is just not very funny. Amazing animation though, it's just seriously, I still recommend watching this for the visuals alone. The topic of SpongeBob SquarePants spin-offs is very polarizing. Ever since the first one was announced a year or two back, we saw a Twitter war erupt, with a group of people denouncing said spin-offs and shaming Nickelodeon for making such a thing, and others not thinking it was as big of a deal, and then Nick could do whatever they wanted with the series. I mean, hey, more SpongeBob could only be a good thing, right?
Wrong!
But why were people this upset? What about this sweet little face could possibly cause such backlash? Well, for those unaware, SpongeBob SquarePants was created by a man named Steven Hillenburg. He worked on the series for the first 3 seasons and very first movie, but after that took a step back to focus on other projects. And also he just created like the biggest thing ever. I think the dude deserved a break. But anyways, he later returned to work on the show with the release of the second film, Sponge Out of Water. However, this return was short-lived, as Steven sadly passed away on November 26, 2018, due to ALS. The issues came in when just 3 months later, in February of 2019, Nick announced that they would be creating spin-offs to try and widen the SpongeBob universe. The problem here? Well, back in the day, Steven Hillenburg was very against the idea of creating spin-offs for the show, even quoting, "You know, one of these days they're gonna want to make SpongeBob babies. That's when I'm out of here." Yikes. Yeah, so people started getting mad at Nickelodeon for going against the guy's wishes right after he had died, and assumed they had been creating it behind his back, or were waiting for him to die in order to finally start milking SpongeBob for all he's worth. The truth? I don't know. Nobody really does. The only guy who possibly knows what Steven Hillenburg thought or would have thought about these spin-offs was Steven Hillenburg, and we sadly can't ask him to reiterate. You know, those quotes were from years ago. Who knows if he had changed his mind, or maybe even knew about them and helped with the development of the series. But either way, what boat am I in with this whole debacle? I don't care. A profit-hungry corporation did something shitty, the sky is blue and I'm fucking epic at arcade games. It's shitty if they did go against the guy's wishes, but like, it was sort of inevitable. What I care about most in all this are the shows themselves. Just because Steven may not have wanted them doesn't mean they're gonna be bad. Were they bad? Well, that's what I'm gonna look at today. As with the announcement of not only a 4th theatrical SpongeBob movie, but also the reveal of 3 fucking spin-off Paramount Plus movies, I feel like this is the perfect time to go in-depth with the 2 currently released SpongeBob SquarePants spin-offs, Kamp Koral and The Patrick Star Show. Starting with the one that came out first, Kamp Koral SpongeBob's Underyears. Now, Kamp Koral had a huge marketing campaign behind it. There were sports event promos, merchandise, and it was one of the bigger shows being pushed on the new streaming service Paramount Plus. They even decided to dedicate a huge portion of the new SpongeBob movie into promoting it. Now, apparently the idea for the flashback sequences in Sponge on the Run came before the idea of Kamp Koral, but when they greenlit the project, I can imagine they decided to insert many more scenes showing SpongeBob and friends at camp, to get you intrigued in this new setting they've put them in. The other day, I decided to go back and rewatch Sponge on the Run for this video, and by god is it even worse than I remembered. Despite being made by the same crew as the show, for some reason it just doesn't feel like SpongeBob. Everyone is written just a little bit off for the sake of conflict. SpongeBob in one scene can be leaving his house, eager for adventure because he's got his best friend hanging around him.
A wingman?
A friend.
Really, Patrick? You'd go with me?
Then in the next argues with Patrick over him being the only hero in this adventure. Like, what's going on?
This is gonna be like one of those buddy movies. We're the buddies.
Not sure that really applies, Patrick.
But the worst thing about the film is without a doubt the pacing. The start is way too slow. It takes 20 minutes for the actual plot to kick in. Then they very quickly get to their main goal in like 20 more minutes. Then they fumble around for the last 50, accomplishing nothing. And there is no scene that exemplifies that more than the pre-climax court scene, where to prove SpongeBob innocent, all his friends come in and recount memories of meeting him at summer camp. How this proves him innocent for kidnapping Gary, I have no clue, but I digress. Judge, my client may have killed the victim and chopped up his body, but he's a pretty swell guy, trust me. I wouldn't have minded this, but with the way it's presented, you know, the whole movie halting, this just came off as a blatant attempt at advertising their new series. And with that, all eyes are on the new show. Could it possibly live up to the hype? No. It's not a good sign when your show opens with a toilet flush sound effect.
The trail.
This series was forgotten about in like a day. Nobody really gave a shit about it except for the people praising the fact that it wasn't a train wreck. And with that, I guess it's time for me to throw my 2 cents in, and discuss what I thought about it after watching a majority of the episodes. It's just SpongeBob in a camp setting. The story of Kamp Koral is quite simple. We're just seeing the daily adventures of SpongeBob and his friends at summer camp, with each main character from the normal show taking on a different role, with SpongeBob, Patrick, and Sandy being kids, Squidward as a camp counselor, Mr. Krabs as the camp leader, Plankton as a chef, etc, etc. What you may be asking yourself is something like, hey, didn't SpongeBob canonically meet Sandy for the first time in season 1 of the show? Didn't he meet Mr. Krabs for the first time in the first episode too? Weren't Plankton and Mr. Krabs like sworn enemies from childhood but they're friends now in this one? The answer to all this is yes. Yes, they were. This was one of the biggest criticisms I saw for the show before and shortly after its release, but honestly this was one of my least biggest concerns coming out of it, because this show has much larger issues that need to be addressed. The biggest one, of course, being, this show has literally no reason to exist. Not as in SpongeBob doesn't need a spin-off, no matter how true that may be. But what I mean is that this series does almost nothing to set itself apart from the original. The only difference is the setting. All of the character personalities are almost the exact same. It would have actually been a little interesting if some of the characters acted different. Then over the course of the show you could see how they ended up the way they did. But no, just about every single character acts the same way as their adult counterpart. The only difference to speak of is that some of the plots are more focused on childlike stuff. Even though all the characters are voiced by their official counterparts, even though in Sponge on the Run they're voiced by babies. Yeah. Honestly, one of the only episodes that did a good spin on the classic SpongeBob formula is the one where SpongeBob and Patrick get in trouble with Mr. Krabs and have to spend their time in timeout. Reminds me of something like Wet Painters, where they saw him as a big threat. But the difference in writing is that where in that episode it's funny to see just how desperate they get in trying to cover up the fact that they got paint on his dollar, because he threatened to basically kill them. But here there really is no threat. Patrick blames SpongeBob and therefore he gets punished, but then Patrick tries to get in with him by getting in trouble, then he does and they get released after a bit of banter. Like, there's no conflict here. That's basically how I describe a majority of the episodes in this show. Boring and tame. And it's clearly not because of the demographic. Despite being a babyfied version of SpongeBob, it's clear that the age market is around the same of the original. It's written the same way. But nothing happens in these episodes, the characters are all just going through the motions. Like the one where SpongeBob and Patrick try to help this anchovy find a new personality. There's nothing at stake here, they don't even follow their own rules.
Patrick! Pizza's not a personality!
Yeah, neither is a chef, but you tried that anyway. There's nothing at stake here, and they don't really accomplish much by the end of it. The whole show just feels like I'm watching 20 episodes of filler. I don't know, if the characters all basically being the same as their main counterparts, it brings up the question of why this was even an original series to begin with. There seriously can't be that many unique ideas you can have with the basic concept of SpongeBob at Kamp. So why not just have it be part of the main series for a couple episodes? It's going on for like 300 episodes at this rate. I think it's safe to say you can afford to switch things up a little. Now that's not to say that I don't attempt to add some new ideas into the show, however. Are any of them good? What do you think? Other than a bunch of random NPCs like this ugly bitch, I don't want to look at her. One of the main new secondary characters they added was this girl called Narlene Narwhal, and her brother Nobby. They're annoying. I don't even know if this was intentional though. Like, they do this thing I really hate, where to make you like a character and think they're cool, they simply just have all the characters around them call them cool. In the episode she's introduced, all she does is get the campers addicted to a candy syrup. Then when they wreak havoc in the camp, she charges Mr. Krabs to remove it from them, basically just scamming him. Once again, where's the fucking conflict? Nothing is happening here. But also, all this does is just make me think this lady's an annoying bitch. Just having SpongeBob say, "Whoa, she's so cool," at the end doesn't make it fucking true.
Marlene is so cool.
And so funny.
And so...
Funnily enough, they actually brought these characters into the main SpongeBob series for an episode, where they are just as unfunny and bothersome. But I guess it is a cool idea to cross over characters from each show. They even actually brought back Plankton's family from the early seasons of the original series in the same episode. Although I'm not sure if I want to give them props for that. New SpongeBob just seems obsessed with reminding you of the old SpongeBob, so that by proxy you'll think the newer ones are good too. Not that they're bad or anything, I just think they're kind of uninteresting. And I did like the brief flashback where we got to see the Kamp Koral SpongeBob animated in 2D. Oh shit, that's right, the elephant in the room! This show looks like shit! I mean, it's a bad sign when even the poster for the show has the characters looking unbelievably lifeless. If you somehow haven't noticed by now, this show is animated in 3D with CG. And if you know anything about TV budget CGI animation, it doesn't look the best. To give credit where credit is due, there is a lot to like about the way the series looks. I think they mostly shine during nighttime shots, where the light source is made clear and we have nice purples and oranges. And they are very, very ambitious when it comes to how much they stretch and morph these models. But despite all the ambition, I can't help but notice how much its animation is held back by the budgetary issues of TV. Like, I couldn't help but notice how much the characters' eyes clip into each other, or their dimples. And a big problem also has to be how much the animators are trying to match the 2D storyboards. The issue with this is of course how hard it is to replicate how surreal and cartoony 2D SpongeBob can get. The second and third movie were able to achieve this as a simple result of them having a much bigger budget. But when done for 2D, it results in a lot of awkward, uncanny looking faces, and jokes that aren't as well conveyed because it's harder to get surreal animation when working with models. There has to be some kind of rhyme or reason to everything. And so I can't even appreciate the jokes they're trying to tell, because I have to spend a second going, oh, okay, that's the joke they're trying to tell. Ha. With them focusing on CGI animation, I feel like this would have been the perfect opportunity to focus more on well-written jokes, than simple slapstick or surrealist humor. Like, I get it, it's SpongeBob, that's what it's always been. But when you're doing a TV show using 3D animation, it becomes way harder to do those things. So in that regard, if them deciding to make the show 3D did nothing but hinder its quality, then why did they do it at all? Well, it's cheaper. And boy does it look cheap. It has the same issues as a lot of 3D shows, where at times shots look very unrendered. Reminds me a lot of Sonic Boom actually, where one episode could look amazing and the other look like dog shit. From what the animators on it have told me, it was due to time limitations, so I can imagine that problem plagued Kamp Koral as well. That's not to mention how ugly the overall shading is here. A big problem I have with a lot of shows nowadays is that they use black to shade everything. Makes it look all dark and not very appealing. That's a really bad issue of Kamp Koral. This is SpongeBob, where are the bright saturated colors? The cool blue sky? Instead we have this piss yellow color. Oh yeah, yum. Seriously, when lit well, these characters look great. I can't understand the thought process here. If there's anything else about the animation I can appreciate, it's definitely how much they incorporated different types of mediums such as puppetry, using live action footage at times, and even using 2D animation sometimes, such as when Sandy talks to her future self from the main show, you know, that was neat. But at the end of the day, none of that could have saved the show. By the way, Sandy looks like the fucking Chipette from that CG Alvin and the Chipmunks show. It's not relevant, I just literally thought of that. But at the end of the day, none of that could have saved this show, because all Kamp Koral is regular current SpongeBob. In a camp setting. That's it, it's nothing. We had one season of the show air last year, and after looking it up, it appears we're getting a second at some point soon, so I can only hope that they improve upon a lot of the stuff I mentioned here. But sadly, a lot of the problems I have with the series is fundamental things they couldn't really change, with the biggest one being how it doesn't do a whole lot to stand apart from the main series. I mean, what's the point in making a SpongeBob spin-off if it literally has almost the exact same staff as the other currently airing SpongeBob? They really couldn't be stretching the team any thinner.
Nonsense!
Yep, here we go. One of the weirdest decisions in SpongeBob history. That being giving Patrick Star his very own TV series. The Patrick Star Show.
This is my show!
In August of 2020, it was announced that we'd be receiving the second SpongeBob spin-off from Nick. This one starring a young Patrick Star, living in a house with his family. Mum, dad, grandfather, and sister, where he hosts a TV show to the public from his bedroom. This is genuinely, no exaggeration, one of the worst TV shows I have ever seen in my life. Every episode of the Patrick Star Show has the same setup, that being none. Things just happen in the series, and there's rarely any kind of consistent theme other than Patrick's show, which there's almost never any kind of plot or goal relating to it. He just does it, that's all. He doesn't want anything out of this. Why do it? The idea of him having a show literally just seems like some desperate attempt at doing something to make it stand apart from the other one. Episodes can have Patrick trying to get an ice cream from the ice cream truck, having a staring contest with his grandpa turning out into an all-out war, or traveling inside his couch to try and find the lost remote. It's literally just nonsense for the sake of nonsense. Now, this was definitely an intentional decision, with even the writers saying they aimed a sideline story structure to free them up to be more surreal and randomly bizarre with the kinds of things they can put out there. Yes, they literally said sideline story structure. Now, am I saying this couldn't work? Like, is it impossible to just make a wacky, surrealist version of SpongeBob where anything can fly? No, not exactly. Even if I do believe it simply shows a lack of understanding for what made the original so special. I mean, sure, the old SpongeBob had surrealist elements, but they were always grounded in some sense of structure, some sort of reality. There was a method to the madness, you know? But in a show like this where nothing matters, I find it hard to care about anything going on. Patrick lives in this Pee Wee Herman-esque house where anything can happen. He has people living under his kitchen table, he can open a door and have it transport him to a dungeon. In a show where anything goes, it's impossible to be invested in this world of the characters. And despite all the insane stuff that happens in the series, it results in it being incredibly boring. Again though, this could have worked. If you're going to make a new show, then you might as well take a different approach and try something new. But I just wish they went further with it. There are times where I can see what they're trying to go for, with each episode being something completely new. But I think they should have entirely buckled down on this. For example, there are a couple times where we see this cool stop motion segment done by the same studio that did the Christmas and Halloween specials from a couple years back. And even this neat segment at the start of one of the episodes, featuring a Patrick robot in space. And that seems like the perfect idea for a surrealist Patrick show. Literally, have it be the Patrick Star Show, where he's trying to do something different in every episode. Have it be an actual show within the universe. And no, I don't just mean him standing outside his fucking bedroom window talking to the camera. How about have each episode be something completely different, something not seen before? Different setting, different story, but the same set of SpongeBob characters to tie it all together. I know how much I bitch about them, but literally just have it be an anthology show. It's still not what SpongeBob is at its core, but it's at least something entirely new. Oh yeah, because then we wouldn't get introduced to all the cool new characters in this show. I'm gonna gloss over the fact that the original series had already established a different pair as Patrick's parents, and even had a full episode later on focused on his sister Sam, who's completely ignored here. Because again, it's SpongeBob. Continuity is not the most important thing about the show. But these characters just have nothing going on about them. Patrick is definitely the one who received it the worst in terms of characterization, although to be fair, that isn't exactly a problem exclusive to the Patrick Star Show, it's something that's been happening in the main series too. Writing for a dumb guy must be really hard, because you have to be careful to keep some kind of balance, and make sure that you make it clear that them being dim doesn't equal them being brain dead. Patrick is brain dead. In the early seasons of SpongeBob, Patrick was more so the guy who he'd turn to for advice. It was implied that he was a little less naive than him, and therefore SpongeBob looked up to him. And the comedy came from the advice Patrick gave him, oftentimes being wrong or leading him into worse situations. You know, Patrick was still dumb, but there was a lot more to him than that. Again, there was like a method to the madness. Sadly though, as the show progressed, and especially in the Patrick show, This has been confused for him being brain dead. He can do or say anything he wants because he's stupid. And I don't know if it's just me, but I just don't find that shit funny. I'm oftentimes just left sitting there like, okay, am I to be shocked by this? The dumb character did and said something dumb. I couldn't have expected that. And for some fucking reason, they also decided to keep SpongeBob, Squidward, and Plankton in this show. Why? If you're going to try and make 50,000 SpongeBob spin-offs, why would you give them all largely the same cast? What is the purpose? Squidward is a paperboy and SpongeBob isn't a fry cook yet. Those are the only differences, and other than that, they act the exact same as their main counterparts. I seriously don't understand the thought process here. Other than that, Patrick's mom and dad are just carbon copies of him. They're dumb and random, that's the character. His granddad is delusional and often annoyed by him, and his little sister is just fucking Sandy, who also appears in the show. I don't get it. One thing I would like to compliment the show on is the animation, although there are a couple things I'd like to note about it that I think overall is a big issue with the main show too. But on a technical level, yes, it is very impressive. In an era where TV grid 2D animation looks very low budget, SpongeBob is consistently one of the most impressive ones I've seen, with how expressive it can be. And the backgrounds in this series are stellar, I really love the colors. But, I don't know, I feel like the new animation of SpongeBob is a little too wacky. I know this is a controversial point to make, and Twitter is gonna have a fucking field day with it, because I always see this being met with, but the animation of the old show was also expressive when off model too. You just hit new SpongeBob. But my point isn't in relation to them going off model, it's instead that I feel a result of them deciding to stretch these characters as much as they can makes the overall feel of the animation to be kinda weightless. Sure, the original did this, but it was very sparingly, and was only ever used to emphasize certain jokes or line deliveries. However, now it's all the fucking time, and because of that I feel like a lot of the slapstick doesn't work very well, because these characters come off like silly putty that can morph and bend any way they want. Sometimes, less is more. Again, the animation is very good, I just personally think it ruins a lot of the jokes they're trying to tell, and that's kind of an issue in a show where 99% of the humor comes from silly slapstick. Again, if I were to describe this show in any way, it's nonsense for the sake of nonsense, and I'm genuinely curious if anyone actually likes or laughs at this sort of stuff, because it definitely doesn't work for me. What I loved about the original SpongeBob was how they could grind these more surreal elements. There were consistent rules that were followed, and because of that it was funny to see how far they'd go in trying to break them. The Nosferatu thing is funny because it completely comes out of nowhere and you weren't expecting it, but in a show where anything can happen and they're constantly telling those level of jokes, it just lessens the impact of all of them. But in a show where anything goes, in a show where anything can happen, it ironically makes it boring to watch because there are no consequences for these characters. So yeah, SpongeBob spin-offs. Not off to a great start, are they? Maybe I'm just too cynical and pessimistic, but I seriously don't have any hope for the next batch of movies they have coming out. The only way I think they could work is if they focus on the characters that are the stars, and not have every other single SpongeBob character present. Unless you want to do something like Tigger's first movie. Don't have it be a whole new spin-off, just have it focus on someone other than SpongeBob. Have a movie in the universe of the original show, but simply focus on Squidward or Plankton, you know? And another big thing I'd recommend is to simply hire some new people to work on them. If you're seriously this hell-bent on expanding the SpongeBob universe and want to do something new, then actually commit to it and do something new. Because having nearly the same staff working on each of these shows just causes them all to blend together and makes me wonder why they even bothered doing this in the first place. Okay, other than that reason. And with that, I'll leave it off there. I could have gone my whole life not watching these series and nothing would have been different. Boy, I sure am wasting my life here, aren't I?